Okay. So the open beta went on for like a week. By the way, they did announce it's not an open beta right now, but they're keeping the beta going basically for the people that were invited to it and the people who got in through Kickstarter through March sometime actually. So it'll still be played. I guess not as many players. Um, but yeah, just throwing that out there. It was supposed to end today and it didn't end. So yeah, I checked into that and that's what's going on. But yeah, after a week of playing it, like pretty heavily, I'd say I have something like 80 Infernal games and maybe 50 to 60 Vanguard games, something like that. And I started with Infernal, so like there was like a learning curve there. Um, I played it a lot. I did like okay as far as the beta went. Didn't really copy any builds or anything. Kind of did my own strategies and everything. Uh, but yeah, like I watched all the pro matches that happened on the EGC thing. And thought about the game a lot. But yeah, here's what my thoughts basically are on it. Okay, so first off, I saw a lot of people with feedback on the art style, which I personally don't get. Like for me, it's just about whether the game is high quality or not. Like for instance, growing up, the only chessboard we had was this really weird, like antique looking chessboard with really weird, looking pieces. It was like all these like guys that look like Sun Tzu or Confucius or something on the chessboard. But I still played because I don't care about the skins. Like, I mean, I would have rather had just a regular chessboard, but for me personally, I don't care about graphics. So, like, I don't really have a strong opinion on that. But I did see a lot of people talking about that and that they don't necessarily like the art style. That there's been like I don't know if it's a vocal minority or what, but for me personally, I don't quite get that because I just want to play. Um, yeah, as far as like the laddering experience, uh, like it's weird how like the MMR calibration happened. I mean, it's the beginning and it's an open beta, so I'm not too worried about things like that. But like for instance, I went like 0 and 10 to start during closed beta right before the open beta started, and went like 0 and 10 like I mentioned, and then from there I went like 40 and 5. Then I played one game as Vanguard, won it, and had the same MMR as going 40 and 5 after 0 and 10 with Infernals. So I thought that was like a little bit weird, but again, not a big deal. I'm sure stuff like that'll get uh, through it. One thing to mention, because it did become open beta and anyone could go and play it, I did see trolls starting to emerge a little bit. Making IDs that were like jokes about Stormgate or the developers or whatever, and stuff like that. Um, and that makes me a little bit nervous about the future because I think that that could be something that happens in like any free to play game. For anyone who knows anything about the Brood War ladder, Brood War, you can make unlimited accounts as soon as you buy an account, and it's truly ruined the ladder. It's just complete garbage. The ladder experience. It's just like you're always playing people way over your level. There's nothing to be done about it because there's so many IDs. So I hope that there's like something that because I believe Stormgate's going to be free to play if I'm not mistaken. But I do hope that they implement something that makes it so that people don't just mass make accounts and like troll people, right? So maybe something like you have to play through a tutorial that takes 20 minutes and you can't just like let it play itself or something like that. I don't know. Just an idea to maybe help that out. Um, Also, one thing about, and again, these are it's early open beta, it's early beta, whatever, and so I'm sure a lot of this will get fixed. But like the messages that people sent in game, like they didn't really make much of a noise. So a lot of times people were typing me, I didn't even realize. And then it looks like I'm being rude or something when I just didn't really hear it. I think it would be better if it was a little bit louder, basically, when the messages come up, because that happened to me a lot throughout where people were like asking me certain things. Um, Towards like in the last couple days after they updated to the map that's out right now, Jagged Maw, they took away the loading screen that showed your opponent. Now, while I don't care as much about which opponent I'm necessarily playing, knowing which race they are is quite important, and they took that away. So that was kind of weird where you had to ask your opponent. and then that opens up lying. So like you have to kind of use like a build that you may not want to end up using. Anyways, those are all pretty small. Those are just like ladder experience, right? So not a big deal. I did notice a lot of strange takes from people overall about the beta, like the quality of the game, and like it's so early on. I don't really understand people trying to make big, vast conclusions. A lot of people were like asking me like, "Oh, what do you think? Is it better than like StarCraft 2 or something?" Or and it's like, well, this is so early. You can't compare it to games that have been out 10, 15 years. And they're letting us play the game a lot earlier than I think a lot of developers do, and I think that that's part of their strategy to get maybe community feedback, build hype, that type of thing. But don't forget, like when StarCraft 2, like the beta came out for StarCraft 2, the game was basically done. Like everyone just started playing it, had every unit, had all the races, right? Like obviously some balance adjustments happened during that beta period and everything, but this is like we have 2 races and we're not up to tier 3 yet, and like so I don't know. It's weird to make like huge value statements about the game. I think a big thing is how fun it is, and it definitely is very fun. Like it's very easy to pick up if you have played Blizzard games in the past. Basically, that was my feel, where like it controls kind of like StarCraft 2 or Warcraft 3 or something like that, right? So pretty easy to get started on that. A few of the things I noticed while playing that I kind of got annoyed with was like unit collision. I think is one of the big ones that I've mentioned several times while I was playing. Now this might be solved by like map, the maps being more wide open or something, but there's definitely like a lot of units bumping into each other, right? The units are kind of like fat overall, and they're trying to shove through these little areas, which did make it a little bit harder to play like late game Infernal, for instance, because they have less ranged units, and their ranged units weren't necessarily very strong, right? So there was like a ton of unit collision going on, and some maps were better than other maps for this, right? Like, there were some maps that were more wide open in the center. Maybe you could just remove a bunch of trees and then have a more wide open area, so there wouldn't be all that bumping. But there was definitely a lot of areas where I was noticing like a ton of unit collision, which again, that can be something to help balance like melee units and as well, right? Is like, well, if you have these thinner areas, don't overdo melee units, because melee units, they can be like hard overall to balance, I think. It's like you have to have them be able to get up and close, but they can't dominate. It's kind of it's always been kind of a tricky thing. The creeps in general, I like the idea of some of these creep camps, like the vision ones. That's like more interesting than a Zelnaga Tower from StarCraft 2. Excuse me, where you're not just like leaving a unit to get vision, but rather you're deciding when to fight the stuff to get the vision. The heal camps are kind of interesting because they're a little bit out of position. And because they're out of position, like it's like, well, you can heal up, but your army might not be in the right place. So I felt like that was always a really interesting choice when to use something like that. Things like resource camps, and well, the speed camps don't do really much of anything except give fiends. I'll talk about that in a minute, but I like the idea of some of these camps. They're not like too hard to kill off. It's like, you make like 3 units and you can basically go kill some of the easier camps. And later on, when you have a real army, like they're never really that hard. So it's kind of an interesting thing. One thing I definitely have to say, it feels very good not having heroes. That's one thing I'm really happy about with the game. I feel like if there was heroes, this would be really, really deathbally, whereas we see a lot of people starting to split armies up, which is always what you want to see in an RTS. How about talking for a moment about gaunts and the idea of infest, the idea of free units. Free units is like a really tough thing to use in an RTS. If you look at like the history of StarCraft 2, that's always been kind of a big issue. Like if swarm hosts, brood lords, infested Terrans from the infester, right? And this is kind of along those lines where you're just like generating units, and that kind of came to dominate the meta. And I'm not talking necessarily about balance here. because balance is something you can change very easily, very quickly. But I'm talking about the actual design of being able to create free units, right? So, like, obviously, we could see some snowballing, especially in like Infernal versus Infernal type situations. But like the running around the map and creeping everything, like if you look at some of the Infernal versus Infernal matches from strong players, it's hard to imagine if you're going to start with the infestability on the Gaunt that the meta won't be just making towers near the speed camp, because whoever wins that's going to win. So it feels kind of like a Zerg versus Zerg from StarCraft 1 where you're literally just going to decide the game like right at the beginning. So I'm not totally sold on Gaunts making fiends, especially at the start of the game. One thing to mention about that I thought was funny, this map Jagged Maw that they put up. This is probably like, I've played a lot of RTSs over a lot of years. And I've even played the map known as Sparkle in StarCraft 1, which was historically the most imbalanced map ever, if I recall correctly. Jagged Maw is the most imbalanced map I have ever seen in any RTS game. It's like, and this is not like a big dig. They should just get rid of the map and not make maps like that anymore. But like the siege camps, along with the infesting abilities of the Gaunt, you literally can't put those two things together, because the weakness of going for those infesting abilities is like, well, okay, your opponent can just make like some static defense, maybe, right? Make a few towers, and the fiends, the extra free units, the fiends aren't going to just kill you. Okay, but what if they have a siege engine now too? It's like, oh, okay, just the theory behind that is incorrect, I would say. I challenge anyone to try to argue that can be okay, or that could be balanced in any way. But yeah, that and the close by air stuff, like that, I wanted to bring it up because it's just it's so hilarious how bad that map is. Like, really, the second most stupid map that I've ever played in an RTS game was, there was this map at the beginning of Age of Empires 3 where you could get the Lakota dog soldiers immediately, and they were so broken, and like both players would just rush up and get that and the game would end. And it's like, oh, this is stupid, we shouldn't ever play this. So it kind of reminds me of something like that, where I'm like, oh, this is like, the game is decided in 3 minutes immediately, and there's not a lot of play there. Okay, so a couple other things, like the way that flying units move over terrain, like when terrain goes up and down, it's similar to StarCraft 2, but I found it more disorienting, if that makes sense, in Stormgate. Again, probably something that'll just be fixed, but it felt like my screen was jumping a little bit. They were coming like way too close and stuff, which was a little bit odd. Excuse me. One thing I definitely wanted to mention was, this is like an idea I've had in my head for a while, where like, one of the big things that can help you measure balance versus imbalance, I think, is the amount of actions that a player has to put into something, right, to deal with something else. Like, okay, so if you have a big army and you attack move, right, how many clicks does your opponent have to do to deal with that attack move? Because you did like, maybe you did like your whole army, a click, right? Now, how many clicks does your opponent have to do? Something I noticed a little bit with like Vanguard with the Exos, and this will probably get partially taken care of. But like, let's say that someone has a big army and attacks you. It's like the amount of clicking that you have to do. Like, when your skill is going to be mostly just through clicking very quickly, micro-wise, on something like an Exo, I'm not a huge fan of that as the way that you want to like measure skill to give value to a player. Yeah, if that makes sense, right? So it's like, okay, well, we want to see the good micro, and we want to see that great execution and everything. And the Exo, I think, it's really interesting with that quick draw hustle thing, right, where they move quicker. Excuse me. But just something I want to keep in mind about that, right? Where it's like, if because it seems like Vanguard kind of plays like StarCraft 2 Terran a little bit, and then Infernals is some sort of cross between like a StarCraft 2 Zerg and Protoss. So it's like, if you have to just put in way more actions to make one race work, it's Well, that generally does end up happening in RTSs where like the race that's considered harder is going to take more speed to use. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as something I feel like there should be an eye kept on that. But like obviously you need things where you have to move quickly as well. I don't want to say because some people think that you can make an RTS and just like have all the skill be in decision making. You can't. That's not how it works. You need to have like a lot of speed involved because it's not just an S, it's an RTS, right? So it is important to have that balance in there. And you can't just do it through decision making. You can't just have it like set it and forget it and like I outsmarted you. That's not actually how RTS games work. So I wanted to put that out there. One thing I want to mention about like early game, right? Like the dogs, right? The scouts. That became very popular for Vanguard, running around with the dogs and kind of having map control and excuse me. I feel like when you play against Vanguard, you almost just 100% have to wall. And it reminds me of Adepts in StarCraft 2 PvP. And it's like, if you look at StarCraft 2 PvP, like 98% of high-level games in StarCraft 2 PvP, you have a wall at your ramp so that you could just stop the Adepts from coming in because they'll just kill your workers too quickly. That's the exact feeling I get from the scouts. And it feels like it takes away a variety of openers because it is so strong. Now, obviously, this is like kind of a balance thing, and I like the idea of the scout. And obviously, numbers can be fixed up, and like maybe the thing is, if you keep them at a point where they can just run in and kill workers that quickly, because they're just so much faster than something like a Lancer, right? It doesn't seem like there's good counterplay, if that makes sense, right? Like it just does not feel like there's significant counterplay there to try to deal with that type of idea of having a unit that fast, that mobile, and doing that much damage early on. So maybe that's something where you just want to make the upgrade later, you know. But yeah, I think and it's kind of goes into the balance territory, and I don't really want to talk about balance too much because balance is just something that'll be fixed over time. But I'm talking a little bit as well about the actual design of it. Do you want to force people to have to wall in and play a very tight defensive play so that they don't instantly lose a bunch of workers and lose the game? I feel like when you design stuff that forces that type of play, I'm not as much of a fan. And obviously we have that exists all over in RTS. But this is a fresh one, so maybe something like that can be fixed. I don't know. Let's see. The mining. So I think it's really interesting the way they do the Therium. The way it kind of builds up, and then you can put a bunch of workers on, or it starts out small, right? So that part is interesting. As far as Illuminite goes, Illuminite is not as interesting, and also you can't adjust where on the patch a worker is. So for instance, let's say a scout comes in and starts harassing your workers, and you have one that's damaged, you might want to move that to the middle patch, and it's not really something you can do, whereas other RTS games, generally you can move your workers around to different patches. So that was kind of weird, I felt like. As also auto build. Okay, so auto build, like where you just hit Q and then build your structure, right? Excuse me, a little bit of a cold still. So the auto build I found to be very non-intuitive as to where it would take workers from. I couldn't find a pattern. At first, I thought it was like where workers are more, or maybe it would be close by. That was very painful. I can't tell you how many times I'm like, okay, well, I want to build stuff here in my main base, and then workers are coming from so far away, it takes forever, right? So the auto build became almost a trap in a lot of ways. So then I was using the Z build, right? Where you grab a worker and hit Z and then tell it to build. And that works really well with Infernals. Like I could grab all my imps and hit Z and hold shift and spam down the buildings I want. You can't do that with the Bobs because they'll all just go and build like one building, right? So a lot of the way that things are getting built feels a little bit non-intuitive, feels a little bit unequal. Yeah, a lot easier to build things with Infernal because of that. It definitely had some issues spamming out mass buildings in the area I wanted them with the with the bobs. Obviously, like a lot of this, you can kind of play around and everything, but again, just some feedback. Uh, one thing that happened also in StarCraft 2, right? We increased the worker count and we got rid of 4-player and 3-player maps and just went to 2-player maps. Okay, so every game in StarCraft 2 is basically just expand immediately. Now, Stormgate's not like that yet, but that's mostly because of the strength of the scouts, the dogs, and the strength of Gaunts running around and just, you know, getting a ton of fiends and you know, having that map control and having that huge attack. But I do believe that those two things will probably be dealt with a little bit so they aren't 100% punishing. So like expanding right away might come up. It might become something that the game goes into, but I feel like there's a chance here, especially if you add in more player maps, to make the game really, really interesting in the early game, because that's something that StarCraft 2 really lacks. The very early game of StarCraft 2, there's not a lot to it. You know, it's so mineral loaded and it's 2-player maps, so you know exactly when you're going to scout your opponent, right? I think that we should really, really try 4-player maps and 3-player maps and stuff like that in Stormgate. It adds like this whole other level of like, when will I scout my opponent? Like, you know, you can it basically makes rushes more available. Like it makes that early game have a little bit of guesswork to it, right? Like you can't guarantee. In StarCraft 2, you're like, I want to scout them at a minute and 30 seconds, and you can just do it. You can't do that in StarCraft 1. And I think that that gives you a healthier early game. So I would like to see more than just 2-player maps everywhere. And I think that that's just going to make it more entertaining and more fun in a lot of ways as well. But yeah, overall, I think it's definitely super fun. I mean, I'm glad that they're keeping the beta going so that I can continue to play. But yeah, definitely just a few things I'd love to see addressed, especially getting that one map that's on the ladder right now taken out. Jagged Maw is, again, the worst map I've ever seen. Anyways, those are my thoughts there. So there you go.